Hello, good morning to those of you joining from the Pacific, and a very good evening to colleagues from the Caribbean and rest of the world who's joining into the session on climate action from the islands, on mitigation and adaptation actions from the islands on the global climate action. We would just wait for everyone else to be joining in. I just see the numbers of participants going up on those who are joining in. So we would just be waiting. And as you will see, there would be also a poll that we are requesting those to indicate like from which region you would be joining in. We kindly request all the participants to kindly fill that. It's just to select the region that you are from so that we have an idea of where our participants are joining in. We'll have a very exciting panel lined up for you to talk on the topic of global climate action, to share the experience from various regions of the world and from various perspectives. So if everyone's done with the poll, we could proceed to start on the panel. And to start off, just to provide a background information on global climate action in context of the UN FCCC or the UN Climate Change Convention. I'm representing the Regional Collaboration Center for UN FCCC in the Caribbean, which is a partnership together with the regional institution. We have similar institutions from the UN Climate Change Secretariat in 5 other regions, including Asia Pacific, Latin America, 2 in Africa, and 1 for the MENA region. And as you will know from the Paris Agreement, that which came into effect with an overwhelmingly number of countries from all over the globe signing in. There was a demand for mobilizing stronger and more ambitious climate action in order to achieve the longer term goals which are set out in the Paris Agreement. And now we are at a stage where we are deciding on what type of activities and actions that we as global governments or the central governments would be contributing in order to achieve those targets that were set in the Paris Agreement. And it is obvious that it will require the governments to work together with the cities, regions, businesses, and investors all over the world if we are to meet those targets set under the Paris Agreement. And in recognizing this, leading up to post-Paris Agreement, as well as leading up to the Paris Agreement through the meeting of the parties in Lima, there was a recognition within the global community, the negotiators from the various governments, that it would be a task that would not only be feasible to be achieved with just the contributions from the central government, that there would be a need to strengthen the collaboration with the other stakeholders from the non-central governments, the cities, the business sector, the academics, etc., in order to lower the immediately the emissions, as well as increase resilience against the climate impact. And in Marrakesh, in COP21, they established the Marrakesh Partnership for Global Climate Action. And this is a central role in the activities of the UNFCCC. And some of the key outcomes of this are a platform. This is the NAZCA platform, which was launched from the COP in Lima, which indicates various climate actions that are taken by the governments as well as the non-government actors in various parts of the world. You would see a global map that you could highlight the various countries that you would want to focus on, and you can see the activities that are taking place. Besides this, there was the Momentum for Change, which recognized and awards for various climate activities in specific sectors. And the recent 2019 winners had been recently launched. So these are some of the activities that have been done at global scale from the under the UNFCCC. But in order to understand what's actually happening on the regions, we have two panelists in this session from the Pacific and the Caribbean joining us. And firstly, I would like to invite Raquel from the Caribbean region. Raquel Moses is the CEO of the Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator. We'd like to learn from her what are the various activities that have been taking place in the Caribbean, initiated by her organization, what her feelings are in terms of the challenges that they are facing and what opportunities are there for the non-governmental actors in order to implement climate action in the islands, as well as also understand what are their expectations from the central governments in order to accelerate and strengthen the engagement of non-state actors. And I'd like to hand over to Raquel. Please initiate your.
Hi, and thank you so much. Are you seeing my screen? Let's see. Are you seeing my screen? Yep, awesome. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Ventura, for the introduction. Today, I plan to speak to you about three things, really. First, a less than 1 minute introduction about the accelerator, a breakdown of what a sampling of 10 of the countries that we're working with have committed to, our assessment of those commitments and the likelihood that countries will reach the targets that they've set, and what are our areas for concern, reasons for hope, and what we believe are the next steps. The Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator was formed in 2017 in response to that year's vicious storms, hurricanes Irma and Maria. The accelerator was the first high-level action out of President Macron's One Planet Summit, and we were launched in 2018 with an objective to create the world's first climate smart zone, and we'd like to have that zone be the Caribbean. What we do as an accelerator is that we help to break barriers, we advocate for the region to have a voice on the issue of climate change, we raise funds, we package projects, we build economies of scale, and we monitor projects implementation. We focus on 5 main areas: renewable energy and energy efficiency, smart cities and resilient infrastructure, oceans and agriculture, electric vehicles, and innovative finance. So let's get to the meat and the country commitments. What we've seen is Antigua and Barbuda wants to increase desalination by 50%, and they're wanting to pursue 100% renewable energy for essential services and 50% overall. They're also looking at actions to mitigate flooding and are implementing waste to energy. Like many of the countries that we're talking to, they're looking at opportunities to bolster their building code, although they were the most overt about it as a part of their nationally determined contribution submission. They signed a deal in 2018 for 10%, which would take them to 30% renewable energy. Because our time is limited, I won't mention the mitigation efforts, but they're on the screen, as you can see, and we know the Caribbean contributes less than 2% of global emissions. And as a result, mitigation sets the tone, certainly, but it signals to the international community that we're serious and we're willing to make the changes necessary for the developed world to make to ensure our survival. In the Bahamas, they're also pursuing desalination, marine conservation, energy efficiency, mangrove rehabilitation, and emissions reduction, although we highly suspect that their priorities would have shifted since the passing of Hurricane Dorian. Some of their plans have been accelerated since Dorian, and others have been are contingent upon the bandwidth that they have as they rebuild. The plan that they had prior, though, was $1 billion plan that they would have struggled to finance, and this was before having to contend with Dorian. So we imagine that they will have quite a few challenges going forward. Barbados has ambitious plans to achieve 100% renewable energy, although their NDC commitment was 65, and they're pursuing an integrated climate action plan, including a balanced portfolio of renewable energy options. We have a Belize expert on the line, but I'll still cover Belize. They're looking at 85% renewable energy, including integrated coastal management and reducing their emissions. Dominica, likewise, would have made their NDC commitments prior to Hurricane Maria and are in the process of revising their strategy with an incredibly ambitious plan. They are looking at smart cities as well as export of renewable energy. They're one of a handful of Caribbean nations with a focus on energy efficiency, and we see that as a huge opportunity for governments to cut costs. The major impediment in energy efficiency for regional governments has been that many of the Caribbean governments have power purchase agreements with private providers, and that has been impacting the value of energy efficiency as an opportunity to cut costs. In St. Lucia, they have a goal of 50% renewable energy by 2030, and they have a target of 35% by 2025 as an indicator of their progress. St. Vincent and the Grenadines had expected to have geothermal contribute to 50% of their energy supply by 2018 in their NDC. Suriname is pursuing energy efficiency, among other things, and we're working with a pilot country in developing a program that we will roll out across the region for energy efficiency that we're quite excited about, and I'll talk about in a minute. Grenada wants to generate 45% of their energy from renewable sources by 2030. And Guyana had indicated in their NDCs a desire to pursue 100% renewable energy, but we're well aware of the changes that have taken place in their focus since their discovery of oil reserves and the intended impact of their priorities as a result. Jamaica has set some modest goals in achieving 30% renewable energy contribution and 10% reduction in their greenhouse gas emissions. So now that we've sort of established what the baseline is and set the tone and the scene, I'll tell you what we've actually seen on the ground, and I'll cover that in a single slide. I'll share with you what I call our confidence level in the achievability of the commitments made, given the progress that has been achieved so far. What informs our confidence is whether countries have projects assigned or have gone out to tender or awarded contracts or in some instances even began construction. I want to caveat this by saying we genuinely believe that countries intend to achieve the objectives that they've set, although some have increased their commitments while others have retreated from them based on a number of external factors. So this is what we've seen. In about 55% of the countries, we're seeing commitments that have either been achieved or significant progress has been made that suggests that they have the ability to achieve these goals. So in other instances, it's either impossible or very difficult to tell, given the progress and the timeframes for achievement, whether or not the goal or success is possible. We're working actively with all of these countries on an ongoing basis, and for that reason, I cannot break out who's doing well and who needs a little more support. But I will say that there are some countries that are walking the walk while there are others that are talking the talk. So that brings us to what are the areas that give us genuine reason for concern? Certainly, the 45% of projects that appear orphaned at this time or where there isn't a viable path to attainment causes us a great deal of stress. And we work with countries not only on their previously stated goals, but on their current priorities. We see a great deal of shifting objectives, which is always a cause for worry, as continued vacillation, of course, will impact the ability of the region to act in its own best interest. The other thing that causes me sleepless nights is the impact of storms. Because we now have 100-year events happening in far shorter time frames, countries that are hit, that impacts 100%, 200% of their GDP, despite their best intentions to have to change focus and become responsive rather than proactive in pursuing climate adaptation and mitigation. So the cost of financing these projects is high, and we're not starting in each instance on a level playing field. There are many instances where countries are engaged in contracts or simply don't have the fiscal space to be able to provide sovereign guarantees required to make the changes necessary. Our job as the accelerator is to develop creative mechanisms to help them to do that. So for example, we're working with the Nature Conservancy on blue bonds to restructure existing debt, to provide fiscal space while pursuing marine conservation. And we consider that to be a unique opportunity for island nations. Lastly, and most concerning, and James knows this is my sort of soapbox issue, is the oil discovery in Guyana and the potential impact, not just on Guyana, but on the region in terms of our priorities and focus on impending climate change versus short-term revenue. So what are the things that give us hope? What's the good news? Well, we're seeing a great deal of innovation in the approaches by governments, and they're willing to embrace new ideas and the private sector. I can't get into detail on many of the most exciting projects, primarily because we're in the assessment phase and we're working through the feasibility, both of the projects and the accelerator's ability to add value. But the specific projects that I see that are giving me hope is there are a number of waste to energy plants coming online, both public and private, and this reduces waste while producing energy. There's a regional initiative for electric buses where countries plan to work together for a cost-effective solution. I mentioned energy efficiency program earlier that will help generate financial headroom while reducing costs across governments. And the method of execution would be advantageous to the private sector as well, creating a win-win-win solution. While donors are incredibly specific, there is a genuine desire to help, but the processes can sometimes be long and arduous. So we're working really hard on that. We're also seeing interesting developments in impact investment that could help us leapfrog our plans in the region. And we're seeing the opportunity to pilot or pioneer tech in the region that can help us mitigate, adapt, increase revenue, export in areas such as blockchain, using recycled plastics to manufacture housing, creating competitive green exports that give us greater market access. And so with all of that, what do I think we should do? I think we should continue to ask questions and challenge the leadership in the Caribbean region to live up to their commitments and to make them focus on long-term strategies versus election cycle actions, because you know, the elections are happening whether or not we want them to, or whether or not they're like the storms, they're coming whether or not we like it. So we have to be able to take longer term decisions in our own best interest. Thanks.
Thank you, Raquel, for that very insightful introduction to the national targets set by the regional governments in the Caribbean, and also the challenges it poses and the opportunities that were identified, and the expectations from the non-government sector in order to engage further in the activities. And from the Caribbean, next I'd like to invite to a speaker from the Pacific region, Palanis Alofa. She's the national coordinator for the Kiribati Climate Action Network. And I'd like to invite Palanis, please also share with us the experience from the Pacific region in terms of the engagement of the non-government sector, and what do you feel are the opportunities and challenges, as well as the way forward. Palanis.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I am not back home in Kiribati. I am actually in Auckland right now. Been traveling for the last 3 weeks. But it's a pleasure to join you as a team to share adaptation and mitigation stories from our islands in the Pacific. Well, the Kiribati Climate Action Network is a network of more than 60 communities and NGOs that are working at the grassroots level on climate change. And we also, there's 2 parts of our work in Kiribati. We do advocacy internationally in the region and adaptation. So advocacy work is really on mitigation. The message we're trying to get to the international body or globally is the 1.5 degrees for negotiations, that make sure that it doesn't exceed that. And we've been working with the Pacific Climate Warriors, and I think you know the 350 movement. And we do not really call ourselves the 350 in the Pacific. We call ourselves the Pacific Climate Warriors. Our regional office is based in Fiji, and in Kiribati, that's our main, the main partner that we work with in the global level to do our advocacy work. But we realize that the working on climate change is cross-sectoral. It touches every aspect and part of our life. So we are not just doing mitigation advocacy, but in the islands, our community work is with grassroots, starting from waste management and mangrove growing and everything else, mitigation and health. And we work with the youth, we work with the NGOs, mothers, we work with women. But one of the things we know that it's happening on the ground is that we are very slow in doing adaptation. And we're also slow in reaching a global body with a message that we need to reduce emissions. Okay, I'll go back to Kiribati. What we're doing now is, because of the disasters that are coming to us. You know, Kiribati is a country in the Pacific. It's right in the middle of the Pacific. And not many people know about Kiribati. But it's the only country that falls into 4 quadrants of the hemisphere. The only country that means it's in the north, the east, the south, and the west. And it's also the country that owns the biggest ocean in the world. So we really falls into a very big space in the world, but we need to contain that to survive, because we have big oceans, massive oceans, and tiny islands. And we really do not have a problem before with these big oceans, but today the islands are being, the biggest problems we have now is coastal erosion. And those little islands that we have to survive on, it's been threatened. And the rising sea level is really the biggest threat to us, because with the rising sea level, it touches every other aspects of our life in Kiribati, on the islands. It touches our water, it touches our food, it touches the health of the people. So what Kirikan has been doing is not just adaptation for disasters, but trying to help the people to live on a daily basis. How can they adapt with the problems that they have right now? And just before I came to Auckland, you know, we had the Met. They announced on radio that they've been giving us a warning that the sea will rise up to 2.95, and the island has only 3 meters above sea level. We only have 3 centimeters left for the water to come over it, over the lands. And I know when the warning came out, people panicked. What are we going to do if the storm comes with this water, or with this, when the sea rises? Fortunately, we thank God that water came up, or the sea came up, but it did not come with a storm. But you've seen previously, we've had storms, and when it come we've had sea level rise with a storm, and we cannot stand that. You know, it will go over our lands and go over the gardens and the food and into houses. So we wish that, you know, we as an NGO, we wish we can have an answer to just to stop this water from coming. We don't have. The only solution to us is let's plant more mangroves, a soft mitigation, and if we have money, let's help the people to build their seawalls or raise these islands. But that's too expensive. Yeah, so when the sea came up last month, it came 2.95, did not come with a storm, but everyone was running around trying to make sure that their seawalls are intact, or they built it a little bit higher. But then for those who do not have the money to do that, government was helping them, sandbags. And I put out a notice from Kiribati Climate Action Note when I worked to our diaspora in Australia and New Zealand, just asking if people can help, we'll try and distribute and help the people to have permanent seawalls instead of just sandbags. Fortunately, we got some funds, and we worked together with the disaster unit in the Office of the President that looks after climate change and disasters, and they gave us a list. This is a list of the most vulnerable sites on the island. If you can help, go ahead. So that's what we do. That's what Kirikan is doing. We don't want just to be on the upfront, just disaster, just to help with disasters. No, we need to help with adaptation right now. We need to stop what is happening. And to help the people to be able to sustain the problems that are coming to them. Like when the sea level rises, you know, we're not gonna wait for the next sea level rise or with the next sea to come up and to come up with a storm. We need to help them now to strengthen their seawalls or to build more mangroves or to help them to make sure that they have enough water to drink, clean water to drink. That's what Kirikan is doing. I remember like 5 years ago when they say there's going to be, you know, a higher, you know, sea is going to come up a few centimeters high. And I said, what's going to happen to the people? So I went and looked for the communities that are vulnerable and to see what they're doing. They really do not have anything, you know, only just strengthening their seawalls. And if they have no seawall, just putting something at the sea to make sure that water doesn't come in. But then one community just had an overnight disaster. You know, broke the seawall and water came in and the whole place was flooded, like more than 500 people. And really, we did not know what to do. Fortunately, some governments help Kirikan to have some fund to make sure that these people have enough water. If seawater comes onto the land, the first thing that it does is to get into the food supply and the water supply for the people. And the water supply is the main problem because people need to drink on a daily basis. So fortunately, some governments provided fund to Kirikan, and we implemented like 24 water tanks to this community, and we fill it with clean water from government 10 times. We said we only can supply water 10 times to all these tanks. After that, maybe you need to put money together to fill these tanks for your drinking water. And so for the last few years, we've been trying to help people to adapt. We brought in, we're teaching them how to grow their food, to make economic, sell it, and to help them to economically so that they can maybe buy a water tank. But those are all soft measures right now. We really need to protect the land. If we can protect the land, water not to come in, then we can move on. And so And so for the last few years, we've been thinking about showing our people how to adapt. So this year, especially in February this year, we decided we're going to have a site. We call it Mitigation and Adaptation site. So on our site, we're going to have showcase to the people, not just the seawalls and mangrove growing, because we've been showing them how to do that, but really showcase to them how to plant their food on a land that is poor, it's just sand, on the land that get inundated on a monthly basis, how to grow food and how to make gardens on this kind of land, this poor land. So that's one, how to plant food, not just on the land, but maybe have vertical gardens, high gardens, so people can grow food. And the different ways of getting water, using the well water, rainwater, whatever. And at the same time, the different types of energy that they can have. So we work with our donors, like Japan was helping us to do a rocket stove. This is for outer islands and boarding schools. A rocket stove is using firewood, but it's clean energy that comes up. It doesn't have a smoke. So that's what, and to help the village people in the outer islands to be able to use this instead of kerosene and instead of gas. And but on the Kirikan site, our adaptation site, we want to have that, a rocket stove, a biogas, renewable solar, the different ways of providing energy. And so,
if I may interject, you have 1 minute more.
Okay. And so with that in mind, water, energy, if we have the site in, what we do, if we have this site well established and there's resilient homes, like a floating house, high houses that are built high above the ground, our people need to see, because our people, they learn by examples. And we thought that creating this adaptation site on the mainland is for people to come and see and showcase the different ways of adapting to the problems that we have in Kiribati. So that's what we've been doing so far. And we're always out there working with our partners and looking for, donations to help our work right at the grassroots level. So Kirikan is really not just advocacy, it's working with grassroots right on the grassroots level, at the community level. And we have partners that do, we also try to, we're part of the Office of the President Committee to make sure that we help with policy making. And we are part of the Kiribati National Experts Group, and to make sure that we have adaptation and mitigation aligned with what government is doing. And so that's our work in Kiribati. Thank you for listening. And we have more stories to share, but we feel that we need to work in partnership, private sectors and the government and us. And that's why I'm here in Auckland, to share our stories.
Thank you, panelists, for sharing the stories of Kirikan and the work, and also answering some of the questions that was posed with regard to the actions on adaptation side and the challenges that you faced through the implementation of your projects, and also the great work that you're doing in the Pacific region. So from the two speakers before, who are engaged in various activities in accelerating climate action on the region, we heard the various challenges that they're facing, and also the support that they and the leadership that they're looking towards from the government side. Our next speaker, the panelist, is a former senator from Australia. She's also a former leader of the Green Party in Australia, as well as currently engaged in many activities, although she has also continued to engage in politics as well. Currently engaged with the IUCN, as well as having a role in the various other green activities. I would like to invite Christine to share with us her experience working at various levels within the government, as well as encouraging and mobilizing the private sector. What experience and what her thoughts are in what the governments could do in order to accelerate and support these activities that we heard from the previous two speakers, as well as, in her opinion, what more can be done and how further the private sector, as well as the other non-government actors could be engaged in climate action. Christine, over to you.
Great, thank you, Ventura, and thank you, Pelanisa and Raquel, for telling us the reality of life in small island states and the very real daily, weekly, monthly fear that comes from engaging with the realities of sea level rise and storms, and also the adaptation challenges. I'm from Tasmania. It's the island state of Australia, and next stop, of course, is Antarctica. And the Great Southern Ocean is our southern boundary. Tasmania is about the same size as Ireland or Switzerland, for people trying to think of how large we are in the scheme of things. But before I answer the question of what governments should do, I want to bring to you this perspective I bring from my experience in government. I'm an environmental activist, and I went into politics as an activist because that's where decisions are made. And it's one thing to rally on the streets, and we absolutely need people rallying on the streets, but you also need people inside the governments who are actually there to make the decisions and to implement decisions. Now, I recognise that because back in the late 70s, after coming home from a year in Europe, I realised that in Tasmania, the future was not in the extractive industries of logging and mining, but our competitive advantage was being on the edge of the world, our clean air, our clean water, our uncontaminated soil, and our wilderness areas. So clean and green became my mantra, and it's very much the competitive advantage of Tasmania, of New Zealand, and I know it's part of what people are building in island communities around the world. It's a way of building resilience. However, it was contrary to the Tasmanian parliamentary perspective and the federal perspective as well. So I was arrested and jailed on the campaign to try and stop the Franklin River Dam in Tasmania in 1983. And then I ran a major campaign to stop Noranda of Canada from building a $1 billion pulp and paper mill in the farming district in which I was brought up in Tasmania. And on the back of that, I got elected to politics. So when I got into Parliament in 1989, I was appointed to the first ever Australian Greenhouse Gas Council, established in 1990. In 2004, I stood for the Senate in order to address global warming and try to drive Australia in a better direction, because I realised then that no matter what we did to secure protected areas, whether it's marine protected areas, coral reefs, forests, whatever, they were all subject to being lost as a result of global warming. And sadly, that is what's happening now in my own state of Tasmania, having worked to get the World Heritage Area, thinking it would be protected. It has burnt the last 2 summers. It's never adapted to fire. The Gondwanic vegetation, of course, has never evolved for fire. And so this is a big issue for us in Australia as it is in California. It certainly is in Tasmania as well. The other thing is that the ocean currents are changing. The East Australian current now comes down the coast of Tasmania, right down the coast. It never used to. It's displacing the subantarctic upwelling. It's nutrient poor warm water, and as a result, the kelp forests are dying. And kelp forests, of course, are a major carbon sink, as well as very important for the fisheries ecosystems. So that's the experience of understanding that global warming was going to destroy even areas that we thought we'd looked after. So I spent 25 years in state and federal politics in Australia as a Green Party MP, and I retired in 2015 in order to work with civil society groups and bring my experience of how politics works to NGOs so we could hopefully get better outcomes in the climate and biodiversity emergencies. And so my experience in politics is very much like that of islands in the global political context, in that I was an outsider in politics in the same way as islands tend to be outsiders in global negotiations. I was a philosophical outsider in that I opposed an extractive mentality, and I was interested when Raquel was talked of oil in Guyana, I think, and we see it everywhere. The minute you can get an extractive industry to inject cash, people abandon all sense of what the big picture was in terms of global warming. So I was on the outside in that sense, and I never have been in government as such, so I lacked the power of government, but I have been in opposition, and also I have been in power to the extent of balance of power in both state and federal politics. So based on my experience in Australian politics and in the global emissions profile, it's certainly true to say that national governments are not able on their own to achieve the level of ambition that is required to pursue 1.5, and that has to be how we talk about things. So I want to address two scenarios. The first is a scenario two scenarios in relation to how national governments or subnational governments engage with NGOs. So the first scenario is one where it's my Tasmanian and Australian experience, and that is where governments are hostile to serious urgent action to address global warming. They don't want to engage globally or regionally and think their only responsibility is to throw a bit of money around if they think it can buy them some geopolitical influence. That's it. That's essentially where they're coming from. Australia and the umbrella group are exactly in that position in global negotiations. They're invested in the idea of national sovereignty. They're essentially bought by the fossil fuel vested interests, and that trumps any kind of global solidarity, which is why the UN process has been so incremental. And essentially, the umbrella group and the countries I'm talking about, Australia as well, are run by the 20 biggest polluters on the planet. So that's the challenge that we are up against. Secondly, even if those countries wanted to act, and I can tell you some people in the Australian Parliament say they want to act, but very often they lack the knowledge, they lack the policies of what to implement, they lack the local know-how on the ground of what is actually the most practical thing to do. Sometimes they lack the jurisdictional intervention. If they're a national government, they don't have power to intervene in certain aspects of state governments and vice versa. But the one thing everybody has to remember about politics is politicians are there to get re-elected. Governments want to be in power and stay in power. And so that trumps everything. Doesn't matter what they say about global warming or anything else. If it comes to an election, that will be secondary. It just depends on what they can be to get into government. So in these cases like Australia and Tasmania, the question is not what central government should do to engage non-state actors. Rather, it's what non-state actors can do to engage governments. And the first thing is to drive them to change. Well, as you've heard from the Pacific, Extinction Rebellion, the climate strikes, the anti-Adani campaigns, the Pacific Warriors, we are all out there as great examples of the disruption that is absolutely necessary. And so the first thing we all have to do is get involved in non-violent direct action to make governments aware that the people have had enough, that incrementalism is over. To do that, we also need to build global alliances between civil society groups, NGOs, sympathetic governments, because many European governments are sympathetic. Obviously, AOSIS governments are sympathetic. We need to build alliances with professional groups like architects who've signed on to the climate emergency, like Engineers Without Borders, organisations like Client Earth, who are prepared to help us with legal actions, taking governments to court. And in Australia, taking governments to court is one thing that civil society does very well, and we do it regularly. So the first thing is drive them to change. The second thing is infiltrate and innovate. So infiltrate means you have to break down the traditional party system that exists in particularly in Western democracies, and get new political players involved in multi-party arrangements rather than one-party states, because that enables a lot of negotiation. And we also have to make sure that national governments stand up to corporate power. National governments have to be made to divest from fossil fuels. They have to review their export finance arrangements, their tax breaks. And so now it's a perfect time for people to start questioning the models of citizen engagement. One was just mentioned a moment ago in terms of a national committee in Kiribati where local groups are involved with government. Taiwan was involved in this conference a few days ago talking about a similar thing with digital engagement. Citizen juries are another way of going, but we have to find a way for people to force their way in. And the best example I can cite from that in Australia is when we achieved balance of power in Australia. I made the government, in order to deliver government to the Labor Party, to set up a multi-party climate committee with experts in it to design a world's best practice, if you like, clean energy package. We set up the multi-party climate committee, and that's one thing I'd like to recommend as a model, to force a government to have in the room all the representatives of all the political players plus experts who can bring to the table what actually needs to be done. But of course it worked. We had a good system, we were bringing down emissions, and then it was torn down by the other side of politics. The next thing we have to do is go around them, around governments. So that means civil society, academics, NGOs working together to develop an agreed set of priorities or a plan. Because one of the problems is NGOs tend to go, we want our climate action, when do we want it now? They don't actually say, what climate action do we want? What does this plan for our country look like? And it can't just be incremental. And that's where innovation comes in, because a climate plan for a nation has to be a way of showing people that driving climate action is actually the best way to deliver better education, better health, better housing, a secure food supply, a secure water supply, and so on. So really important that we get NGOs, academics around the table with global donors, and we work out a collaborative plan so that there's no duplication. One of the big problems with governments engaging with NGOs is the competition between NGOs, between global ENGOs, local NGOs, and within those contexts. That is a function of fundraising largely, and it's a big problem. We need to have a collaborative, negotiated national plan that's public, because that's the only way the private sector can get transparency and you can get fair tender processes that aren't money through the back door, which is often what happens, and duplication of what's necessary. The other thing to do is exploit the differences between levels of government. In Australia, we have a hostile federal government, we have a hostile state government, but you have city governments, local governments who are very proactive. Sydney has signed the climate emergency, Hobart has signed the climate emergency, and local government is where you've got waste management, transport options like electric vehicles and cycleways, covered walkways, you've got housing and construction specifications and permits, local food security. So you have to work with whatever level of government is the most likely to engage and deliver for a population base. And there's always that opportunity to do that. I realise the time's going, so I'll just quickly address the second scenario of engagement, and that's where a national government or a subnational government really wants to take action, and AOSIS is an example of that, and there's huge opportunities for a leap forward, but what they have to do is adopt, as I said, the whole of government approach, and that's one of the things that's been lacking in many governments. They don't have a whole of government approach to climate change, and they need to do that. They need to be educated. Solar Heads of State is a small example of that, but it's where an NGO educates people at the top who then implement education programs and negotiated outcomes through the whole society. In Tasmania, for example, we have a floating pier that's really an architectural innovation. It can be adapted for desalination or for hydroponics or whatever's necessary, renewable energy generation. The private sector developers want to know where in the world is there a country who has the right circumstances in which this could be implemented. We don't have the roadmaps from the countries who desperately need this, a national plan so that the private sector can look in and go, yes, I think we can address that. So my final remark is that if you have a national government which wants to act, it has huge advantages in being able to broker up to the global conventions, global funding bodies, multilateral engagement and so on, and to work down with NGOs. They have to see that their responsibility is as a broker, and we have to insist that they do broker those arrangements. Otherwise, that incredible opportunity to access the Green Climate Fund, for example, to access global philanthropists is lost to NGOs because often they don't have the governance arrangements in order to be able to accept those funds. So we need to have governments brokering those arrangements and leveraging action in subnationals if they won't agree. So New Zealand's a good example where the national government has come in and said from now on, all government procurement in New Zealand has to be low emissions and low waste. Local government has no option but to then transform how they deliver on transport services and the rest, because every tender that goes out has to tick the boxes on those spaces. So I guess my final point is we're not going to survive if we wait for governments to decide what to do, because my experience of politicians is the majority of them do not know what to do. The majority have never worked with NGOs, never worked in patch in the pants organisations at all. And so they need to be forced into a collaborative arrangement in new democratic structures to engage and deliver on the scale and with the urgency that we're talking about, so we don't end up with ad hocery and duplication. Thanks very much, Ventura.
Thank you, Christine, for that insightful first-hand experience of what needs to be changed in the government process. Also, the engaging multi-party packages for bipartisan decisions on climate change, mobilizing activities, as well as a call for bottom-up drive for climate actions for engaging the government, and also the way that you could act through the multi-level governance process in order to take action, engaging at city level or the regional level governments, as well as the central governments. Before we move on to our next speaker, just a bit of housekeeping. There is a question for Pelenise in the Q&A. Please, if you can take a look at it, and also one question for Christine. We would welcome everyone to submit your questions on the chat for the question and answer section that you would see on your window. And now, after looking at the experience from the national and some national governments, we would like to look at how are the needs of the developing countries, small island states, being reflected in the negotiations. We are fortunate to have Carlos Fuller joining us from Costa Rica, where we are having the pre-COP, where we are preparing for the COP or the global convention of the parties that's going to take for the global climate talks that are going to happen in Santiago end of the year. And the key topics that are being discussed is how are we going to mobilize and implement the Paris Agreement. And I'd like to hear from Carlos. What are the views from the small island developing nations? What are the expectations from the negotiations? And what you feel should be the outcome that would actually drive more ambitious climate actions in terms of the expectations from these small islands? Carlos?
Thank you very much, Ventura, and good day to everyone around the world. So yes, I am here in San Jose attending the pre-COP, which has been dubbed the unconventional COP, because besides having the formal meeting of negotiators and ministers responsible for climate change, they have also arranged many other activities focusing on oceans, focusing on gender, focusing on civil society. So indeed, it is almost a mini COP that is occurring now in San Jose and has just concluded. Coming into this year's negotiations, the Alliance of Small Island States is pushing for three issues that need to be resolved here, well, in Santiago de Chile at the end of the year. The first one has to do with ambition. As you know, all parties are required to submit new NDCs in 2020 because of the present NDCs are on a trajectory towards a 3 or 4 degree world. While we recognize that in the Paris Agreement, we have called for as far below 2 degrees Celsius as possible, aiming for 1.5. This was reinforced by the IPCC special report on 1.5, which noted, first, temperatures globally have already risen by 1.1 degrees Celsius, and we are already seeing the adverse impacts of that of climate change. A terrible hurricane in Bahamas last month, the ones that affected Dominica and Barbuda 3 years ago, and the slow onset events that we're seeing, sea level rise, saltwater intrusion, droughts, and so on. So we're already feeling the effects at 1.1. The report shows at 1.5, it gets far worse, but we have about a 50% chance of taking adaptation measures to address that impact then. At 2 degrees Celsius, it is cut down to about 10% in small island states in issues like coral reef, fishing, and so on. So for us, it is a matter of survival at 1.5. So at this COP, we're saying we expect parties to pledge renewed NDCs much stronger, and to reduce, in those NDCs, a pledge to cut emissions by 50% by 2030 and to become carbon neutral by 2050. That is a matter of survival for us. So that is the first aspect. The second one has to do with part of the Paris Agreement that was not resolved last year, and that has to do with Article 6 regarding market and non-market mechanisms. Unfortunately, we've been debating this issue for the past 5 years, and we're seeing very, very little progress going forward. At this session, as the ministers made their presentations yesterday morning, we heard a lot of coincidence around certain aspects dealing with environmental integrity, avoiding double counting, leading towards a global mitigation ambition. And so we're seeing that aspects of it. However, a few parties want to roll over some of the Kyoto Protocol units into the post-2020 agenda. And our position is saying, no way. Those emission reductions that occurred prior to 2020 and are banked, how in the world can you say that is going to contribute to the new agreement? So we really have to overcome that issue at this COP. And the third one has to do with the review of the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage. We know the loss and damage mechanism was established to to address was, it was to look at the impacts of climate change and to avert, reduce, and address loss and damage. Well, we are already looking at averting and reducing, but how do you address loss and damage? How do you help the people in Abaco who were displaced by this major hurricane? That is what we're talking about, addressing loss and damage. So we would like to see the review of the WIM at COP25 in Santiago, address those issues so that we can address the present loss and damage that we're already experiencing. Before I leave, I just would like to introduce some of the work of my center, the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, in the areas of adaptation and mitigation. So we were established back in 2002. We became operational in 2005. Some of the measures we have already implemented across the Caribbean include saltwater reverse osmosis systems in Grenada, in St. Vincent, putting in a stronger hurricane code in St. Lucia, and actually rebuilding a hurricane shelter there using this new building code. Working with one of the major hotels in St. Lucia to capture rainwater, to use that as their drinking water, and to use wastewater to irrigate their greenery. So these are the kind of adaptation measures we're taking, but we're also looking at the co-benefits of mitigation. So all the reverse osmosis systems that we have put in place, and we know that requires a lot of energy, we have overcompensated by putting in solar power systems to drive it, but by putting it more that it requires, we can then sell the excess electricity into the grid, and that provides the resources for the new owners of these systems to maintain the systems. The worst thing you can do to any community is to give them a new technology, and then when the project ends, they don't have the resources to keep it going. So we believe that we have now addressed that issue. And the center is now an accredited entity, a regional implementing entity of the Green Climate Fund. We have several projects at the Green Climate Fund at the moment. However, one was already approved, and that is a $45 million project to assist Barbados with their water resources. So again, besides addressing the issues at the international level, we are working with the Caribbean to make them more resilient and to address the impacts of climate change. Thank you, Ventura.
Thank you, Carlos. For that, the inputs on the expectations and the discussions at the negotiation table that have been taking place at Costa Rica and what's expected at Santiago, as well as also the activities of the 5Cs in Caribbean and some of the actions, climate actions that had taken place. So we have around 5 questions that are not being answered. I would like to lead off with touching some of them, while I will leave some of the specific questions that was directed to Christine and Pelenice to be responded by them. There was a question about engagement of media. So it's about how we would like to engage media in order to pressure the governments as well as the other climate actions. Maybe I would like to direct this to Christine from her experience about the role of media and how you would, in a smart manner, engage the media in order to drive actions. Christine?
Thank you. The media is incredibly important because that's how you get the message out there and spread communication. But the problem is that significant parts of the media around the world are the problem. So the Murdoch media in particular is a huge problem in the UK, in Australia and in the US. Because of their climate denialism and their association with think tanks that are basically funding climate denial around the world and funding political parties that support fossil fuels. So one of the things we have to do is single out the Murdoch media for a start as being not credible when it comes to reporting on climate, because as long as people treat them as a legitimate source of media, then they continue with that. I think we should encourage those other media outlets that have now said they are going to stop reporting climate deniers, that they're going to focus on the science. The Guardian, for example, has adopted language around global warming that they want used by all their journalists, and I think we should take that background and introduce it to the various media outlets in our various countries around the world. The third thing is the public broadcasters. The public broadcasters used to be fearless, if you like, and independent, but in recent years, because their boards have been increasingly politicised, they have tended to be less than giving fearless commentary on what goes on. So I think there's a big job for NGOs to not only engage the media with good news stories about adaptation and planning and new technologies. People are always interested in those and they get a good run, but we also have to take it up to the various media outlets to make sure that they report the science and report it in a fair way. Here in Tasmania, for example, we had 10% of Hobart's population turn out for the climate strike. It was really fantastic to see 22,000 people on the streets of Hobart. The local paper reported it on page 3. It was just incredible, and that's because it's a Murdoch paper. So we, of course, had to make our views known about that. But yes, I think media is important. The second thing is social media. No two people get their news from the same source anymore. It's one of the problems for getting the messages out on climate, but it's also an advantage in getting around governments and getting around biased media outlets. And so I use Twitter a lot for being able to spread information, and I think using social media to engage with other activists around the world and spread ideas is a really good way of going. So we need, I think, to be better at distributing our ideas in that way. And the third thing is traditional media is now under the pump. They have reduced the number of journalists they've got. They've got very few investigative journalists anymore. And if you make content for them, they will frequently just run it. TV stations will just run it. If you make a 1.5 minute video for them, or YouTube video, they will upload it and use it as is. So I think there is an opportunity now for NGOs and universities and similar to provide content to mainstream media that is usable for them.
Thank you, Christine. I would like to touch on one of the questions that was raised earlier on, which I believe is relevant, and I'd like to hear actually more from the practitioner's point of view on the question about, in perspective of islands, the mitigation versus adaptation. We heard both examples from Raquel as well as Pelinese on both adaptation and mitigation, and also the various activities that you are engaging in both the fields. But there's always, I think it was also highlighted about the contribution of islands towards the overall percentage-wise global emissions, which is standing low. So why is mitigation still an important activity, and why from a practitioner's view that it's important to be engaged? Raquel, maybe I'll open with you.
Sure. So from our perspective, we see there's far too little being done on adaptation, and I absolutely agree. But what we find mitigation gives us, in addition to helping us to become more resilient. So independent power supplies, for example, which helps us to not use diesel and to generate solar, is a part of our mitigation, but it is also a part of our adaptation, because relying on the sun rather than having to get diesel flown in helps us to be more resilient and to recover quickly after a disaster. But it also helps for us to set the tone that we are not asking anyone to do anything that we are unwilling to do. The mitigation is difficult and it is expensive, but we are some of the lowest emitters and still taking on that charge, because we, as Carlos had put it, our survival depends upon it. And so we need to be able to hammer that point home. You know, I adore Greta Thunberg, and I think her work is amazing. But climate change is going to hit us a lot faster in this region, far long before it hits her. And she's taking decisive action. So we need to have an even greater sense of urgency in terms of both adaptation and mitigation to be able to move forward.
Pelenese, do you will have something to add to that from the Pacific and your own perspective in engaging in climate activities? As you also mentioned several actions that you take place, that you engage in the Pacific, like the efficient cook stores that are relevant to mitigation, whereas there's always the question of why adaptation, why we are talking about adaptation when it's not priority in some parts of the discussions for the islanders.
Yes, when it comes to mitigation, we know that the Green Climate Funds, they separate the funding for mitigation and adaptation. But I realize in the last few years, we've been concentrating too much on adaptation, and like mitigation is really for the developed countries. But I realized that we really need to push for mitigation. We really need the developed countries to really do something about mitigation. So one example is my trip here is to listen to a company here that is called GGII, Global Green International Investments. One of the problems we have in Kiribati is waste. We have too many important goods that come to Kiribati. We have little land to remove this, and we do not know what to do with all the plastics and all whatever that comes. So with this company that I talked to, they could use all this waste and create energy. So two things, they can come up with a diesel from it, but the diesel is renewable. It does not have sulfur in it. So we can just use this to remove all the waste and have the diesel to continue to generate, using it for a generator that provide electricity or energy to the country. Or if it's not energy, if we use renewable energy, we could use this diesel to provide for motor vehicles and ships that comes to Kiribati. So those are it's really not just government that have to look at this. I am going to promote this to my government because we are too slow. We think it's too expensive to talk about mitigation. But really, the solution to Kiribati is the root of the problem. The root of our problem is fossil fuel or energy. So we really need to talk about mitigation more than just adaptation.
Thank you, Pelenese. So while also we are with you, there's a question about how you ensure more engagement of local communities, the local governments in climate actions. As you mentioned that you've been engaging the local communities in your region, in the islands, in the Pacific. I would like to ask you, like, how do you think that you could strengthen their role further, and what more needs to be done in that aspect?
Yes, how we did it right, we've been working with communities right now, and one of the things that really strengthened them is knowing their human rights. we've been talking about adaptation and mitigation and climate change, but once we start talking about the human right that is being taken away by climate change, that's when our people woke up. You know, like they are aware of this, and now they're putting their stories together and they're pushing government. They're taking their complaints or their concerns to government through our NGO and to the disaster office and to the climate change office. And I felt that once we started talking about people's human rights that has been impacted or affected by the climate change, that's when you strengthen them and they really understand today why they need to speak up. They need to know they need to do something. Before that, no, we would just advocate. We start talking about human rights. Communities are waking up, and they're coming up with it.
Palnes, I think you're breaking up, but I'd like to make you to turn back to Raquel to say if you have any last comments for the participants.
Yeah, I think that, our position at the Accelerator is oddly to remain optimistic. I think a sense of panic can be a great motivator, but it can also have people throw up their hands and believe that it is too late and nothing can be done. There is still a lot that we can do, but we just have to continue to work hard and fast and be really decisive. Christine, I thought your points about the specific kinds of actions that we could take, and there was a question on the line asking for you to share those actions with us, because I think they were absolutely brilliant and provided really tangible and tactical things that we could do. And I really want to thank James as well for his work. That I don't believe that James actually sleeps, because all day, every day, he works hard at this, and this is what it takes is a community of people willing to get up early every morning and work all day, every day at making change.
Thank you. Christine, any last remarks for this session?
Yes, thank you. As an NGO and who's worked in government for a long time as well, the critical thing is be specific. Be really specific about what you want and how it fits into a holistic plan. And then once you've got that, you can go out to both government and the private sector to actually deliver on it. My frustration is that there's been an awful lot of duplication. My final other point, though, is one of the issues that needs to be resolved at national and subnational levels is land tenure, because in many cases, places that are destroyed by extreme weather events or are vulnerable to sea level rise, people currently don't have the option to move to higher ground or move to other places because of land tenure restrictions. This is an issue that I think needs innovation and a lot of cultural context, obviously, but this is critical. I presume to the Caribbean, it certainly is in the Pacific. And before we can deliver long-term sustainable solutions, one of the issues has to be, how are we going to change, how are we going to modify cultural ways of viewing land so that there is a capacity to be inclusive of everyone into the future. And then the final thing is, we have to recognise, as we heard from Kiribati, that there are going to be people who are going to be displaced because they're going to lose their ability to grow food, have fresh water, and are vulnerable to being swept away. And that means we have to have the global discussion about people being able to migrate with dignity. And I think that is something people don't want to talk about. It doesn't suit particularly the polluters of the planet and countries like Australia to talk about that. But I really fear that unless we have serious new ways of democratic engagement we're going to end up with putting up more borders and pull up the ladder, Jack, we're all right. And that just simply isn't going to work if we're to strengthen democratic institutions and respect people's human rights and right to exist as a culture. So that's my final thing, that when we're talking about mitigation and adaptation, we also have to recognise we are at a crossroads here. It is more serious than people recognise, and we need those solutions being discussed at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine, for highlighting the important point of the social and economic impact that need to be considered while in the process. And finally, I'd like to turn to Carlos to know what, as the chair and the senior negotiator in the process, what you think we could expect from the outcomes of the negotiations from the international community in December, and what we could look forward to as island nations in terms of how we could accelerate these climate actions, both in terms of mitigation and also addressing the impacts of these extreme weather events which the islands are experiencing with the recent devastations we've seen in Bahamas. What do you think would make a difference in this?
Thank you, Ventura. And let me say, the insights from the panelists have been really tremendous, and will assist me in pushing the issues of the small island states at our conferences. But I'd just like to add to some of the comments that were already made. So you asked about why should mitigation be important for SIDS? And in the case of the Caribbean, I will give you one concrete example. When the cost of petroleum was $100 per barrel, we in the Caribbean were spending 70% of our foreign exchange importing energy into the Caribbean. Obviously, if we had been using our own domestic natural resources for energy, that foreign exchange could have been used to enhance our resilience to the impacts of climate change. So, so mitigation for us is going to be as important for financial reasons as opposed to for the impacts onto the environment. But also, as AOSIS, we are actually promoting all members to produce new NDCs next year to show the international community that if we as small island states can do it, you should be able to do it, and even much more. So in fact, we want to name and shame, and that is going to be our motto. On the area of getting engagement of the local communities, I want to give you a very good example of what I saw at the Climate Week in Salvador, Brazil, a month ago, where I chaired a session, and the mayor of Arima of Trinidad and Tobago was there showing the work that they're doing. And I think by getting them involved in the process at these Climate Weeks in the Caribbean, in the Pacific, in the Indian Ocean, indeed, it brings negotiators to go together with practitioners to show that indeed we are translating what we're seeing at the international level down to the local community level, but then they can also feed that back up so that we get the engagement. One of the areas I noticed at the UN SDGs summit last 2 weeks ago and the various side events, I had a session where the International Chamber of Commerce was there, along with the International Trade Union Congress. And they are all involved in addressing the issues of climate change. The unions, because they want a just transition, and the Chambers of Commerce, because they're recognizing the potential opportunities for new investments. So they recognize it at the international level, and we need to get them, encourage them to talk to the national chambers of commerce, to the national trade unions, so that they become on board and they can pressure governments to act responsibly. So coming out of COP25, I do believe that we will be seeing new initiatives by the Chilean presidency. First of all, oceans is a new area that they would like to introduce into the process, recognizing the importance of oceans as a major contributor through the blue economy to be able to address climate change, to mitigate and to actually capture some of the carbon, but then also to be able to address the issues of adaptation, because we certainly need to get that group, that community involved in it. So I think we're going to see a new movement towards that area. Chile is fully on board in enhancing ambition, because that is a legacy they would like to be able to deliver to the UK in Glasgow, where those new NDCs should be evaluated. So I think they would like to push in that area. Again, Chile is really hinging on a successful Article 6 conclusion to be able to say they closed the book on the Paris Agreement and all the rules that needed to be adopted. So I think they will be doing a lot of outreach to those countries that are not presently on board. And I believe they heard it at this pre-COP of where most of the countries want to go. And I believe they will recognize that where most of the countries want to go is where the laggards need to come along. And I think they will be doing a lot of tremendous outreach in October, November, and then going into December, when they start off with an actual heads of state meeting prior to the opening of the COP. So I think that is going to be addressed there. And then finally, on the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage, I do believe that they will exert influence to ensure that the harmful effects of climate change, that these marginalized communities are already feeling the impacts, will be addressed. So that is what I'm seeing as a successful outcome at COP25. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos, and all the panelists, Raquel, Christine, and Palnese, for all those wonderful insights and sharing of your experience, as well as your thoughts and expectations for more ambitious climate actions. And with that, I'd like to also thank the organizers, James and the crew, for putting together this wonderful session. We have one more day to go in this virtual climate summit, which we would expect also further turnout and success. And looking forward to also the participation and more participation in the years to come, and the continuation of this wonderful initiative. Thank you.
And thank you so much for your master moderation, Ventura.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ventura.
So with that, we